Welcome back. The Department of Justice announced plans to revoke citizenship of some migrants living here in the United States. To talk more about that, joining us as always is our dear professor, Professor Richard Tapia from Florida. Professor Tapia, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me onto the show. It's a pleasure to be here.
Professor Tapia, we heard the news. The Department of Justice announced its plan to revoke citizenship of some migrants who were not born in the country, born outside, but came here and take an oath to say, yes, I want to become a U.S. citizen, but somehow they plan to revoke the citizenship. Explain to us, how does it work? What is the process?
Well, once a migrant achieves naturalized citizenship, remember the process is an extensive process that requires an application, an interview process. If at any point throughout the process someone lied on the application or in the interview, then citizenship can be revoked. Under the Obama administration, there was an effort to go after people who have committed crimes or lied on the application, such as former Nazis of Nazi Germany during the Second World War, people who lied about being a member of the Nazi Party, or people who lied about being part of an oppressive regime. And so when they applied for citizenship within the application or throughout the interview process, they denied having any type of involvement. If later new evidence arises that they were part of an oppressive regime, if they were part of the Nazi regime and they lied about it, if they were part of a cartel, then naturalization can be revoked and the person could cease to be a citizen. That does not mean that the person loses the right to due process. One has due process regardless if you're a citizen, naturalized, born here, or if you're an undocumented immigrant here in the country, you still have a right to due process. But if you lose your citizenship right, your naturalization right, because you lied on the application or you lied throughout the interview process, then there is a pathway in which naturalization of citizenship can be taken away. And this predates the Trump administration. We saw it under the Biden administration and even under the Obama administration as well.
So you mentioned the gangs and also lying about, in some ways, throughout the application, maybe the reasons to revoke the citizenship. Explain to us how the process worked. Is it from the Department of Justice or through Congress?
It is through the Department of Justice, right? It's already written into the law. You must be truthful when you're basically applying for U.S. citizenship. And the law is clear that if you lie about the facts, whether in the application or throughout the interview process, then your naturalization can be taken away, it can be revoked. And so the process has been that the Department of Justice will basically bring it before a court. You still have a right to due process, you still have a right to challenge it. And if the court agrees with the Department of Justice, the court can order for citizenship to be revoked.
So you mentioned the process is happening through the Department of Justice. And also you talk about previous cases under the Obama administration and the Biden administration. How many cases were being successfully revoked some citizenship under the Obama or under Biden, and under what ground?
So again, the Department of Justice brings forward the case. It's going to be the courts that's going to determine whether or not the person did lie. Was it a material lie? Did the person knowingly lie on the application and in the interview process? And then it's going to be the court that makes that determination. But the number of cases, most of them during the Obama administration, once again, it dealt with former members of the Nazi Party that were members of Nazi Germany and lied about the application. Many of these individuals were older individuals, but the Department of Justice has always had a policy not only in prosecuting and finding former Nazis that were hiding here in the United States, but also people that were at one time members of the Communist Party in oppressive regimes throughout the world that later came here to the United States and lied on the application. So there's been a number of cases over the years. The success of those cases determine on whether or not there's enough evidence to support that the person knowingly lied. Is there evidence to support that someone was an active member of the Nazi Party during the Second World War? Were they a member of the SS? Did they participate in the Holocaust in some fashion? Were they members of a cartel, of an organized crime organization, and lied about it on the application? And is there material evidence for the courts to basically agree with the Department of Justice? So there have been a number of cases. You're talking about a considerable number of cases that the Department of Justice has brought forward against former members of the Nazi Party, former members of the Communist Party, former cartel members over the decades. Now, what we're seeing here with the Department of Justice, the question is going to be, are they going to really follow due process the correct way? And I think that's kind of the concern that we've heard some critics about the current move of the administration. Are they going to allow the courts to make that determination, or is the Department of Justice going to try to just do it through executive action, in which case that will then become a constitutional issue because it will have to go before the courts.
You talk about due process, and we saw so many cases still happening here in the U.S., especially the case of Abrego Garcia, where the media was extensively covering the due process, and senators and other folks were mentioning the due process that is a violation, and how the government need to comply to the decision by the court. I wanted to narrow the conversation a little bit to Haiti. We know lately the State Department declared some of the gang members in Haiti are now considered terrorists, and also some of the sponsors. Let's take into consideration someone who were someone who was somehow a gang member in Haiti, or a sponsor of a gang member, but is a U.S. citizen, naturalized U.S. citizen. Can the Justice Department go after that person?
So, if I understand the question correctly, if a naturalized citizen of the United States is part of a gang, an organized crime organization here in the United States, can they be stripped of their naturalized status? And that's going to depend on whether or not they
And it would be
lied on
both
the
ways,
application.
also from
When
the
the application
U.S. and in Haiti as well.
So if the person is a member of a gang and they lied on the application and they lied during the interview process, then their citizenship can be revoked by being part of that organization and failing to disclose that they were part of that organization. For instance, if you were in the former Yugoslavia and you participated in acts of ethnic cleansing or acts of genocide, not just in the former Yugoslavia, but in Rwanda or any other state that engaged in acts of genocide. And you're asked on the application, have you now or ever been a member of any organization that has committed crimes against humanity, genocide, and so forth? And you say no. And there's evidence that comes out that you did participate. You participated in acts of mass murder and death squads, in going after people, or part of criminal organizations that basically terrorize people, and you lied on the application and you lied later in the interview, then your naturalized status as a citizen can be taken away. But now that doesn't mean that your right to due process is taken away. If you're a US citizen born here in the United States and you didn't lie in the application, but you participated in those types of acts, then you could be tried for crimes of mass murder, crimes of genocide, and so forth. And it's going to be under the jurisdiction of the United States Department of Justice. That basically says that US citizens must conform with US law, even if they're not in the United States. So a US citizen, born US citizen, will have the right to due process and will have to stand trial for such crimes. Someone who was a naturalized citizen who lied about the application once it took place, then can have their naturalization stripped away. Now, if they didn't lie on the application, if they didn't lie during the interview process and they engaged in those acts thereafter, then they could also be prosecuted under the United States Department of Justice and Code because they violated US law and international law. And the United States can basically arrest them and bring them to justice.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about deportation now. You mentioned some cases if someone born in the US is a US citizen, now they can prosecute that person, criminal charges. But if you were not born in the US, you become a US citizen, there's a process to revoke your citizenship. Let's talk about deportation in both cases. Can they deport a U.S. citizen born in the U.S.? In the other cases, can they also deport someone who became a U.S. citizen?
So you cannot deport a U.S. citizen born here in the United States. You cannot deport that person. You can't deport a U.S. citizen, period, right? Now, if a person's a naturalized citizenship and they lose their citizenship, then the person can be deported. But they must lose their naturalization process through the courts, through due process that they had given a material misrepresentation, they lied, and so forth. A U.S. citizen cannot be deported. That's that's the short and end of it. Now, can a U.S. citizen be extradited to another country to face criminal charges in that country? The United States has had a policy of not extraditing our citizens to other countries. That policy can change, and a U.S. citizen can be extradited if the Congress allows it, if U.S. policy changes to allow for that citizen to be prosecuted. At the moment, it is U.S. policy not to extradite any U.S. citizens.
So, if I understand correctly, now it's up to Congress if they want to change that policy for a U.S. citizen, a born U.S. citizen, to spend time in jail outside of the U.S., to be extradited outside of the U.S. in some other ways. But that has to be the process has to happen first inside of Congress.
Right. So the U.S. does not deport its own citizens. When it comes to extradition, and extradition is when a person is being accused of committing a crime outside of the country. The U.S. policy right now under Congress is that the U.S. does not extradite its own citizens. That can change by Congress. Congress can change its policy and allow for U.S. citizens to be extradited.
Let's talk a little bit about due process. And we are seeing right now with the new administration, there's a fight with activists. There's a fight with U.S. Justice Department with with the respect of the due process that is not happening in so many cases. Give us an idea of how the U.S. Constitution is seeing the due process.
Well, the U.S. Constitution, under the Fifth Amendment, says that citizens must be given due process, especially if your life, your liberty, and your property is in danger. So that means you must go through a legal process in determining whether you are guilty or not guilty of the crime that you're being accused of. So due process extends not just to U.S. citizens, but it also extends to resident and even undocumented immigrants. In fact, the Supreme Court has gone as far as saying in the Hamden case, US v. Hamden, that even suspected terrorists in Guantanamo Naval Base that's being detained by US forces or anybody detained by US the federal government, the military and otherwise, has a right to due process. So when it comes to suspected terrorists, it's not full due process, but anybody who is in the United States or in the jurisdiction of the United States is entitled to full due process. So that means before you're deported, you have to be given the right to go before a legal proceeding, a right to basically hear your case before the courts. And it's the courts that makes the determination whether or not you are here within legal or illegal parameters and you're open to be deported. So I think it's clear the Supreme Court over and over again has said, regardless of immigration status, all persons in the United States are protected by the Constitution and the Fifth Amendment of that Constitution, which means they have a right to due process. So they have a right, whether they are legal or illegal, documented or undocumented, citizen or non citizen, they have full due process constitutional protection.
Professor Tapia, we heard a lot about the 14th Amendment. What is it, and what is our viewers should keep as important part of the 14th Amendment?
So, the 14th Amendment is probably one of the most important amendments on the United States Constitution. Number one, it guarantees birthright citizenship to all persons born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And subject to the jurisdiction thereof has been the clause that has caused the most amount of controversy. But the 14th Amendment basically says, and this was upheld by the Supreme Court in United States versus Wong, that all persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States. So it gives birthright citizenship, and it creates the legal principle of this idea of jus soli, which basically means right of the soil. So if you're born on American soil, regardless of your parents' immigration status, you are a citizen of the United States. Now, there are some exceptions, and that's why the provision and subject to the jurisdiction thereof has been what the Supreme Court centered on when it was reviewing US v. Wong. And in that case, it said, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof excludes only the children of foreign diplomats, the children of enemy occupiers, and they also said Native Americans. It's not going to be until the Snyder Act of 1924 that Native Americans are going to be given full citizenship rights. And that had to do with the fact that Native American nations at that time were seen as a domestic nation within the United States and had certain sovereign rights. And there were some nations that didn't have treaties with the United States. That changes under the Snyder Act. And so that's why that clause, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, has been the controversy. Now, what was the purpose of the 14th Amendment? The purpose of the 14th Amendment was multiple. One, it was to overturn the Dred Scott decision of 1957 that basically said that slaves and former slaves were not citizens of the United States. Now, with the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, it guaranteed that all persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States. And that is regardless of race, regardless of the nationality of the parent. And it created this idea of jus soli, right of the soil. And so when the Wong case came before the Supreme Court, Wong, to give a background to the viewers, Wong was a U.S. citizen born in the United States. His parents were Chinese immigrants. He went to China, and when he came back from China from visiting family, he was denied entry into the United States. And they claimed that he was not a U.S. citizen because he was born to undocumented Chinese immigrants. The Supreme Court sided with Wong and has upheld that decision ever since. And for close to 100 years, the Wong decision has been the center point. And the Wong decision was at the turn of the 20th century. So we're talking about 100 years and more. Birthright citizenship and this principle of jus soli has been enshrined and interpreted within the 14th Amendment by the U.S. Supreme Court. To reverse this idea of jus soli, it would take a Supreme Court decision basically reinterpreting those provisions within the 14th Amendment. Some strict constructionists, right, have made the argument, and they are in the minority, that when it says, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, they believe that it's up to Congress to basically create the provisions. The Supreme Court has taken a different interpretation, and they say, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof meant all persons born in the United States or subject to the jurisdiction. So if you are, let's say, a service member and you're on a military base abroad and you have a child, like in the case of former Senator John McCain, who was born in the Panama Canal Zone on an American military base. He wasn't born on American soil, but he was born to American parents on an American military base, and so therefore was a subject to the jurisdiction of the United States that made him a U.S. citizen. And so the Supreme Court has interpreted that provision as such, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof based on the U.S. v. Wong. It is highly unlikely that the Supreme Court will reverse the decision of U.S. v. Wong. And so there's been a lot of controversy over recent executive orders trying to rescind birthright citizenship, but I see it very unlikely for the Supreme Court to do that. What else did the 14th Amendment do? The 14th Amendment also gave equal protection under the law. It says that regardless of who you are, The law must treat you equally. And if you create any law that creates a double standard, you must have a rational basis for that double standard. If you do not have a rational basis, then you create an unreasonable burden or classification that is not justified and it violates the US Constitution. It also said that your constitutional rights not just protected you against the federal government, but it was applicable to the states as well, it protected you from the state government as well. So the
Right.
14th Amendment is a very powerful amendment for the reasons mentioned.
There we go. A very great overview about the 14th Amendment and the importance of it, not only for an immigrant, someone who were not born in the U.S. But come in, but also U.S. citizens. We are not taking a lot of time to go through the U.S. constitutions to understand what do the importance, the rights, the duties that we have to follow. But we really appreciate your time today, Professor Tapia, explaining to us a little bit of the U.S. constitutions. I hope that we can have you more to talk about some other aspect of the U.S. constitution. Not only that, but also the U.S. politics and international as well. Thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. Always a pleasure.